are live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch.
I'm world famous. Suddenly, I've become a massive brand because of you, Keith. That was the week that was, and it was an important week. Last week I thought was a rather dull week, maybe a late week in August 2020. But in this first week of September, things are really starting to happen. I think really important in terms of the history and the future of technology. The first big story, the major story of the week in tech and perhaps even in politics, is the Trump announcement that they are going to launch an antitrust investigation of Google. Finally, some good news coming out of the Trump administration, Keith. I know you're a big fan not only of antitrust but of Trump as well. Fair?
Andrew, I'm not a big fan of attacks on big tech for being big anyway. And what happened is quite remarkable. The New York Times did a great job of covering it. But Attorney General Barr announced yesterday, against the advice of his 50 state attorneys, all of whom want to have an antitrust case against Google, but don't believe they yet have a case. He said, well, screw that, we're going to do it anyway. And so he accelerated the whole thing. Obviously, it's an election ploy. The Democratic response is the most interesting. They, of course, also want to have an antitrust case, as we saw recently in DC, but they want to do it themselves after the election. They don't want Barr to get credit for anything.
Surprise, right?
Right. So the interesting thing is they're all aligned. And they all want to go after Google, and no one disagrees. But the whole thing is a sham. The whole thing is a sham. If you look at the basic question, which is Google a monopoly? Let me just put this up from this week's newsletter. This is Google's share of ad revenues compared with Amazon and Facebook last year and this year. Look at Amazon. Amazon is gaining share in search. Right. Facebook is almost as big as Google now. So clearly, this is not a monopoly. It's a market shared by at least 3 big players. And therefore the lawsuit will fail. It's the whole thing is.
Well, yeah, but let's address some of the more interesting things, because that's everybody knows that. Firstly, why? I mean, my guess is that the average Trump voter doesn't even know what Google is. They don't care.
Yeah, I think that might be true. I think the average Trump voter doesn't care, and it's probably an attempt at a media distraction by getting them to focus on this.
It's not even that big a deal for media. I mean, it's compared to the other stuff he's doing. I mean, in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or any of these other marginal states, it's not exactly going to have any impact in any way. I don't really understand what they're doing. And do you think that? Do you think it somehow reflects something about YouTube?
I have no clue. What's your theory? I mean, I know they're going to lose.
My theory, well, I don't know if they're going to lose. My theory is that they Google was the 800-pound gorilla 2 or 3 years ago, and that's all anyone's been discussing for the last couple of years, and they forgot about Amazon. They probably forgot about Microsoft as well. And Apple, of course, is another case. So my guess is that they had too much invested intellectually already in the investigation of Google, so they just flipped the switch. But I don't know.
Well, you've got to assume that 50 state attorneys thinking they haven't yet got a case should be taken into account, right? So the fact they're not being taken into account, you would only draw 2 conclusions. The first is Barr knows something they don't, which I think is very unlikely. And the second is Barr has a reason for doing it unrelated to the chances of winning, which is more likely. So your mind immediately goes to the election. You're right, though, Andrew. Who's against Google? It's really the intelligentsia who don't like being tracked. And it's the whole debate about data and Google. There was other stuff this week where Apple announced it's delaying blocking cookies and trackers for 12 months in the face of Facebook opposition. Facebook argued it would be heavily hurt by Apple's moves. So this whole space of big tech data tracking is not Trump's space. It's been Elizabeth Warren's space, a little bit Bernie Grant's space, a little bit
Sanders.
Sanders' space. Sorry, maybe all Trump's trying to do is take some wind out of the Democrats' sails by too.
To me, what's interesting is that it speaks of the inevitability of this, whether it happens now under Barr, under a Biden administration, or a Trump generation. I think this stuff is pretty much unavoidable now. So I think it represents the reality that these companies are going to, in the long run, be broken up. For better or worse, you can argue backwards and forwards. I tend to think it's a good thing, but I accept your arguments are credible. But that's the reality. I think that's what Silicon Valley has to come to terms with, is that in the long term, over, say, 10 years from now, Google will be split up, Amazon will be split up, Apple will I don't know if they'll be formally split up, but something will happen to Apple. These companies are too large, they're too powerful, and that's politically unacceptable and probably economically unacceptable too. And whether you like it or not, it's a reality, and Silicon Valley has to come to terms with it.
And I don't necessarily disagree with you, because trends have a way of evolving and maturing and happening. That said, I think from the standpoint of innovation, and put it into the context of the USA and the world, the USA is in relative decline except for in one place, tech. And its world-leading companies are big for sure, but they're not criminal. And by criminalizing them...
But you're not criminalizing them. I mean, Scott, you didn't cite any of Scott Galloway's work, but I think he's particularly persuasive on this. And Galloway's argument is if you split up Amazon, for example, into web services and e-commerce, you're not undermining their innovation. In fact, if anything, it helps both sides of Amazon become more innovative. If YouTube becomes an independent company, you're not undermining their innovation. So I don't see why splitting these companies up is a shot at innovation. Why does it undermine innovation?
Well, because the decision making about whether to split Amazon up shifts from the Amazon shareholders to the state, and the state is highly unlikely to be able to make a better commercial decision on whether to do that, and if
but it's pretty obvious. But let's take Google, for example. There's only 2 bits of Google or 3 bits that make any money, right? There's the search engine and there's YouTube, and those clearly need to be split up because it should be a church-state division between content and search, between the book and the library, and that is, in my view, a very healthy development. If YouTube becomes a separate company,
it's complicated, Andrew, because it came out this week that Facebook Watch now has 1.5 billion viewers. So if you were to do something with YouTube that was good for Facebook, you're impacting the market in unknown ways.
Well, so what?
If there was only YouTube, you may be able to argue.
YouTube is so ubiquitous and strong. I mean, whatever's happening on Facebook, you know from this show that if for some reason or other that was the week that was pissed off YouTube and you couldn't be on that anymore, you'd be dead.
Actually, not true. Our biggest audience comes from a combination of Twitter and Facebook. Our biggest audience. YouTube is one part of it, but a very small part, because YouTube isn't really for shows like this. YouTube is, if you look at the content, it's music videos and stuff like that dominates their stuff. The third is Twitch, by the way. Twitch is bigger than YouTube for this show. And when LinkedIn eventually switches us on and allows us to do video, I suspect that will be the biggest of all.
But I really don't understand why the antitrust stuff upsets you so much. You're a startup entrepreneur splitting up these big companies can't be bad for startup entrepreneurs. You're involved with me with now.tv. The less power these huge tech conglomerates have, the better for startup guys like us. I don't see why it's so offensive to you.
No, it's a good question. I mean, there's two parts of my thinking, and one part, let's focus on a phenomenon I hate called acqui-hires. Google and Facebook and Apple and all of the big companies can go to a startup very early in its life that has talent. And if the startup is struggling to raise its next round, which is almost always the case because it's hard to raise money, they can offer to acqui-hire the talent, suck them into one of the vortexes, and gain from their talent internally, right, which kind of undermines innovations. And I agree with that. That's true. It's not monopolistic and it's not illegal, but I hate it.
But let's be clear as well about antitrust. But let me just be clear about one thing with antitrust, which is often misunderstood, is that it's not illegal to be a monopoly. That's not what antitrust law is about. It's simply about ways in which one business, which happens to be a monopoly, benefits other parts of the business. So Google search, whether or not it's a monopoly, it's a very strong business. And the argument is that Google search is used to strengthen YouTube and vice versa. That's what's illegal. Being a monopoly is not being illegal.
That's correct. It's what's illegal is the abuse of monopoly power.
Right.
Now, just to break it down, Andrew, Google's business is not search. Search is a cost center for Google. It makes no revenue from it.
Well, it's an advertising, but it's right. Advertising business is built on its search engine.
Correct. Now, once you're in the world of advertising, it's a divided market with Google as the net loser over the last 5 years, with Facebook as the net winner. And it's roughly a 50-50 market now, not quite, but it's getting there. Whereas it used to be 100% Google. So if you were to take the temperature of the moment in history,
right,
Google is at its weakest point since it was founded.
I agree with that. I think that's a fair point. But then you're not arguing against the principle. You're simply arguing that Google got unlucky being in the sites first. Are you in favor, in principle, of splitting Amazon into a web services and an e-commerce company? Surely they're too big for everyone.
I don't feel like there's any reason to say yes to that I would benefit from. I mean, it's like, it's their business. They paid for it. Let them decide for themselves.
Well, again, it comes back to the way in which the two sides of the business benefit each other. But you would accept then that this, for better or worse, this is becoming an inevitability.
I do think that's likely, yeah. Especially if Biden wins, which also seems inevitable to me.
And all my conversations with VC friends, from people like Borthwick and Wenger to others, none of them like these big tech companies. None of them benefit their businesses. So I don't really understand, for you as an investor and entrepreneur, why you'd want to protect these leviathans, who tend to be quite conservative anyway.
Well, because I also don't like large elements of them, which we can talk about, but I have principles. My principle is the state should not interfere in normal business unless the crime is being.
So basically, the techno-anarchist in Keith triumphs over the startup entrepreneur.
The left, it's the left.
And you would be horrified, Keith, with this triumph of ideology over self-interest.
I only believe that ideology should be a tool for the pursuit of self-interest.
Is this the first time I've ever won an argument with you?
Have you won?
I feel I'm winning. I'll let you off this one. This will be one that we will come back to time and time again. The one company we haven't mentioned, which isn't really a monopoly and which also is sort of intriguing, though, in this space, is Facebook, which is in the news for other reasons this week because of their decisions on political advertising, which is also enormously significant. What's Zuckerberg been up to this week, Keith?
He has been pontificating about the election, especially as it gets closer, and asking himself the question, how will we react to not be participants in an unfair use of our platform. And he's talking about, the closer we get to the election, the more he won't take political ads. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but that's one of them. Because he needs more than 72 hours to be able to react. So 72 hours before the election, no more political ads.
Sensible, right? I mean, well, you can't criticize that.
I think it's just an acknowledgement that technology is not yet real time when it comes to assessing content. And he's just acknowledging that, which is true. People talk about AI and machine learning, but it really is still very early, technically speaking.
So what else is significant in this news about Facebook? Are they bowing to Trump, to the Democrats? It's not. I wasn't clear entirely of the politics of this.
There are really no obvious politics to it because it's going to affect everybody. But I have noticed Facebook subtly. For example, there's a big thing at the top of Facebook. If you haven't been on Facebook recently, it'll come up saying, "Are you registered to vote? Click here if you're not." And
what about splitting up Facebook into Instagram, Facebook, and then the telephone company, whatever it's called,
WhatsApp?
Surely WhatsApp. Isn't that another logical play that would benefit everybody, including perhaps even the people at Instagram and WhatsApp?
Well, if you think that being big and owning lots of things is bad, yes, but you need a reason. You can't just suddenly decide someone's business should be 3 businesses just because you think it's too big or you don't like it.
Yeah, I just interviewed Sinan Aral, who's an MIT professor. He's just come out with a new book called The Hype Machine, in which he argues the only way to save social media from destroying society is by turning it into a kind of inoperable platform where everyone can talk to everyone in the way in which a Sprint or an AT&T and Verizon smartphone can talk to one another without the brands getting in the way.
So you're going to get me going now, because remember, you and I created email as a address.
But let me just finish that. Let me finish the thought on that. What Facebook are trying to do with making the sort of this walled garden of Instagram and Facebook and the other products in the firm is fighting against that inoperability. So again, it's in everybody's interest to break them up, and in that way, everybody can come to the table and come up with a better overall platform. Or am I wrong here?
I would say any internet company that is a container of content is only successful insofar as it does something the internet is bad at. So if the internet was really, really good at video calls, you wouldn't have FaceTime or WhatsApp or Skype. If the internet was good at chat, you wouldn't have all these chat apps. The internet is good at some things. It's good at email. It's good at web. It's good at moving.
Well, it's not that good at web now because of all the apps, right? I mean, it's increasingly an iOS world.
It's not good at mobile. You're right. Mobile web isn't as good as app mobile, quality-wise.
Yeah, and even when you say it's good at email, I mean, email is increasingly an archaic medium used by old people like you and I. My kids never use email. It's hard to even get a response to them on it.
Correct.
Speaking of old guys like you and I, you have picked one of your favorite old guys, Malik, who has an interesting piece this week on how Windows 95 and the web made each other a hit, which only people, I think, of our generation would even understand. What's going on there? Why is this important?
I think it's not important. Let's start there. It's fun. So,
It's
um,
nostalgia.
although I think Ohm, Ohm could have just written an ode to Windows 95. Brad Silverberg was the guy who ran the Windows 95 team at Microsoft. He's a friend of mine, and uh, he liked the tweet that I did that copied Ohm's thing. Now, what Ohm has done is something more than that. He said if it wasn't for Windows 95, the web would have been different and slower, worse. Maybe it would not even have happened. And the reason for that is Windows 95 was the first Windows that had Internet Protocol that allowed you to connect your PC to a modem and see web pages. Windows XP didn't have that, and neither did Windows 2000 or any of the earlier Windows. When I launched EasyNet in 1994, we used something called Trumpet WinSock to make Windows 3.2 use the internet. And so it was a geek's game. You could only use the internet if you were geeky. With Windows 95, suddenly everyone could use it. And they did. And that really opened up.
Yeah, it is an interesting take, because I always think that Windows and the web was a zero-sum game, but Ohm is suggesting that actually they went together. This is, though, the distant past. It's many centuries ago in digital time. You also have a couple of really interesting links to the future of us, you and I, Keith, and everybody else, and then the future of the world at the beginning of the 22nd century. So rather than thinking about Windows 95 and the web, which are now both incredibly archaic, let's think ahead. Why is the future important this week?
Well, the future is in our hands. I mean, it's one of the most important things I think human beings can understand is that there's no inevitability in the future. So one of the things, let me just show it this week.
Although we have argued that one thing that is inevitable is the breakup of big tech. But apart from that, there's nothing inevitable.
Nothing else is inevitable, right? So this is from Visual Capitalist. It's the world population. And it shows that by 2100, Nigeria will be bigger than China, because China is going to shrink by half. Nigeria is growing massively, and India will be the world's most populous country.
Are you sure this isn't just another Nigerian scam trying to get us to invest in Nigerian stock or something?
It's well, that depends whether you believe it or not. But the future isn't inevitable. What does that mean? This could be completely rubbish if the birth rate in China doesn't decline in the way people say it is. It won't happen. So human beings actually make decisions today that becomes the future. So we have a lot of power. And the more conscious we are about our actions, the more the future will look like the future we want. You can invent your future life today. And in fact, today is the only time you can do that. So the choice is be an observer and a victim of what happens, or be an agent acting to make what happens different. And I think that's a really important lesson. That's what every startup founder does when they start a company. They become an agent of change.
So this is your reference to the Daniel Gilbert TED Talk, in which he talks about taking ownership of your future self.
Yeah, that's from the Harvard Business Review, which is in this week's newsletter. And that really is recognizing that you are three people. At least three people. Your past self, which shapes a lot of who you are. Your present self, which is where you're struggling to figure out what to do. And depending on how you deal with the present self, you are building your future self through your decisions. So on occasion, I've got real depressed. If one of my startups failed and it was my fault, and
it was always your fault, Keith.
It was always my fault. And if I get depressed and then I sit on my hands, I'm definitely creating a future self, which is going to be useless. So I've learned over many years, the only thing to do when you're depressed is to do something, because by doing something, you change what you are. And by changing what you are, you forget to be depressed and you start to get excited about the next thing. So I think it's a kind of really interesting take on history. History is made by people, and people have to make conscious choices if they don't want to be the victim of it.
I agree, and I think the best futurists. I always note this talking to Bruce Sterling, the great science fiction writer who lives in Turin, a friend of mine. The best futurists are actually excellent historians. You can't be a good futurist unless you have a grasp of history, and vice versa, actually. And the problem all too often with tech entrepreneurs is that they're locked into the present. So, Keith, what's the future Keith Tier? What's the Keith Tier of the turn of the 22nd century when the world will be dominated by Nigeria?
Well, so let's assume I'm not going to be dead soon, which is a big assumption.
I don't think that will happen.
But I am actually very focused on trying to do a better job of deploying money into the best startups in Silicon Valley. And this week I updated on thatwastheweek.com. I have a bunch of data, which are leaderboards of the best angels, the best microfunds, the best VCs, measured by scoring them against their outcomes. And I updated it this week, and I received a lot of inbound interest from family offices mainly who have money to deploy, saying, how could we use that data to put our money into the best companies in the Valley? And there is a good answer to that. So probably my problem set right now, there's three things. That's one of them. The second is working with Infarm, which is a portfolio company of mine that just raised 120 million euros to do vertical farming, to improve food and its availability in cities. And then I'm still working, of course, with ADV, my UK fund, with a portfolio of about 40 companies. So I'm busy. And the future me is whatever that all turns into.
And I'm guessing the future Keith will be a SPAC man, because what would that was the week that was be without some discussion about SPACs? So, and I know your tweet of the week is a SPAC tweet, and there's all sorts of developments on the SPAC front. Is it becoming mainstream? Is it a serious thing now, or is it still for financial geeks like you?
It's a really serious thing. This is the tweet of the week from Iris Choi. By the way, it's a long tweet with multiple sections, and it's the 101 on SPAC. So if you don't know what a SPAC is, get the newsletter from That Was the Week. It'll be published in about 2 hours from now. This is in it, and it gives you the 101. But even more interesting this week, Andrew, is that Reid Hoffman.
Right, I was going to mention that. The grown-ups are getting involved. Anything that Reid Hoffman gets involved with, I start taking more seriously.
Yeah, where let me just find that.
Him and his sidekick Pincus, these were the guys who essentially invented social media at the end of the last century, at the beginning of the 2000s. So these guys know what they're doing.
So the answer is it is becoming mainstream. It's becoming very mainstream. And Fred Wilson at Unisquare Ventures agreed with us, actually. Last week, we made the point that from the point of view of a company, a SPAC, an IPO, or a direct listing are pretty much all the same thing. It's just that there's a lot of SPACs now. And if it makes sense for you as a founder, you should do it. But it's wrong for an investor to have a preference over any of those three. And
I saw that there was some talk this week of a SPAC taking Airbnb public, which
but
he's first. I mean, I know it wouldn't happen, but it's an interesting discussion.
He decided not to do it in his case, but let's watch that space. But SPACs are billions and billions of dollars sitting inside publicly listed entities, waiting for you to bring your startup and merge with them. And it is real and it's big.
And is it good in contrast with big tech companies? I assume it's all good for entrepreneurs. We've talked about this before.
It's all good.
You're slightly ambivalent, though. I mean, it's not a miracle for entrepreneurs. They still need a good idea and a good company.
Any entrepreneur that goes public via any method, including a SPAC, that isn't ready to be in front of investors every quarter announcing their results, better not do it. But if they are ready, any of these methods are fine.
Well, that was the week that was. I think it's an important week, a week in which Washington finally aims its bayonets at Google, a time when Facebook is acknowledging the fact that it's not perfect, when SPACs are again in the news. I look forward to talking to you later in September, Keith, when I'm sure there'll be many more developments on all these fronts and more.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.